After suffering the heartbreaking loss of Edith Keeler in City on the Edge of Forever, I'm afraid Captain Kirk had some more tragedy coming his way. In actuality, in a lot of ways, you would think that City on the Edge of Forever would have been a good way to end off the first season. But it's not like they ended on the... Well, they end up being silly and somewhat inappropriately in this episode. But the guy just wasn't going to get a rest here. In fact, the opening scenes of Operation Annihilate, Kirk looks very upset. And one could, if he wanted to, say, well, he's still in a bad mood after what happened, with his time-warped adventure there. But no, he's already concerned because of the mission he's currently on as the show opens. And what has happened is several colonies throughout the Federation have suffered an outbreak, of where people seem to go insane. And they can't quite figure out what's going on. And it's spreading to other colonies. And eventually it seems to be spreading to a planet where Kirk's brother Sam is living. And apparently some sort of scientist doing some research there. And so Kirk's all concerned and whatnot. And, of course, yes, this bizarre outbreak has reached the planet. Is it Nineveh or Dineveh? I can't remember exactly how they what the name of it was. But and as they approach, there's some guy committing suicide by diving his spaceship into the sun. So they tried to save him, but they can't do it. And before he dies, they can hear him. His only transmission is, I'm free, and then he's dead. So, gee, what's that mean? So they beam down to the planet. It seems all very empty and quiet. There's no people around. And then all of a sudden, a mob shows up, and they're all crazy. And they have to phaser him down. And in the actual, I forget what the location was. I should have looked it up, but I didn't. But it's one of those sites that say, you know what, good enough. It looks futuristic and kind of alien, and it kind of does, as the modern art sculptures around and stuff. And it works. Besides, it's a bunch of people from the Federation and from Earth and whatnot. So the architecture and stuff, that it looks recognizable somewhat, stands to reason because, well, they're human beings. So Kirk goes looking, investigating this. Of course, what he really wants to know is, what's up with his brother. Well, they find out. They find the apartment where his brother was living, and his wife's there screaming. And he finds his nephew unconscious on the floor, and then, well, there's his brother, and it's too late. He's dead. Actually, the scene is very quick, but if you notice, it's actually William Shatner with a different hairpiece and a mustache posing as Sam Kirk, Kirk's brother, and he didn't make it. So Kirk's pretty upset about this, of course. And there's even some scenes like when we talk about how Spock has to deny his emotions, and yet, oddly enough, Leonard Nimoy ends up emoting more than the rest of the cast because it's this odd play there. And it's the scene where Kirk's all depressed and he's got this moment where he's just having to absorb the fact that his brother's dead. And but Spock's got to report his findings to him, and he takes a minute there and he's like, oh, geez, oh, God, how do I address this? And then Kirk notices him standing there and says, yeah, tell me what you got, So... they're still baffled as to what's going on. Kirk's sister-in-law is, all in pain and not making sense and whatnot, and the boy's unconscious. So McCoy beams them up to the ship to take care of them there. And eventually they find out what the problem is. Well, in this one room they come upon, there's these weird... I don't know. They look like really nasty fried eggs that are pink and blood-stained. Jeez. But they're, I don't know, some kind of amoebas. And they're all sticking to the wall, and they're making a buzzing noise. And this, so the pathogen is literally delivered by these creatures that must have traveled aboard spaceships that went between the different planets and whatnot. And once they infect a person, they drive them insane as they try to take over their bodies to push them to spread them even further. They later discover that these are actual individual cells of a larger organism that's just not in a body. So it's working to just take over as many hosts as it possibly can. To what end? Well, who knows? And they were suspecting that these are creatures from another galaxy, maybe another dimension. They don't know. And it's just kind of left up in the air. You never really know. I suppose there again, it's one of these stories that one could have followed up on later. And then, oh no, they've come back, and we find out where they're from and all that. But the purpose here is the dealing with this problem, and it's left up to the Enterprise to do it and try to stem the infection and cure it. Before they can do all of that, after they've phasered these creatures, and it took quite a bit, they could withstand phaser fire to some extent there, and they're really stunned by that. And then all of a sudden, one of them is not so dead, and it leaps up onto Spock's back, and Spock is now infected. So they take Spock to sick bay, and Bones is trying to figure out what to do. Spock, unlike human beings, is able to resist what the pathogen is trying to make him do, and he eventually beams down to the planet, despite everyone's better judgment, to capture a sample of the creature so that they can work on it. And eventually they discover that, ultraviolet light, surprise, surprise, which is very true, pathogens can't survive in that, except Bones doesn't quite figure out that you don't need the full spectrum of high-intensity light until after blinding Spock in an experiment to see if he can actually cure him of the disease, which it does, but unfortunately Spock is blind. And it's like, oh God, it's just one tragedy after another, and Kirk is sickened by it, and Bones is all guilt-ridden and everything. This is one of these things that they might have carried this on into further episodes until finally Spock had recovered, or they'd found a treatment or what have you. Instead, they just wrap it up at the end. Spock comes onto the bridge, and they're all like, Spock, well, you can see. And he says, oh yeah, it turns out I got an extra lens because of the intensity of the Vulcan sun. He's developed another lens that protects him, and so the blindness was only temporary. And of course, curing the planet, they blast it with the light spectrum that you don't even see, and of course they wipe out the creatures. Now, at the moment of Spock's recovery, and they're sitting there, this is at the very end of the episode, after this really sad story, Kirk's family's wiped out and all this stuff, and Spock's almost blinded, or is blinded, and they think it's permanent and all that. But what do? They do the typical show of the times. Let's end on a joke. Now, I mean, you could argue, well, some levity here and there, take your mind off of horrible thoughts and whatnot. But geez Louise. And it's not that it is a funny scene. It works well within the camaraderie between the three of them. But at one point when Spock had lost his eyesight and Bones was all guilt-ridden about it, and he said, Spock is the finest officer in the fleet, and I just, ruined him, whatever, something along those lines. And then later, as Spock reports back to duty, he's recovered, and then McCoy tells Kirk, well, don't ever tell him I said he was the finest officer in the fleet. And then Spock whirls around and says, why, thank you, Doctor. And so Kirk says, you're worrying about his Vulcan eyes. You should have been worrying about his Vulcan ears. And I mean, okay, it's funny, but I mean, after all that, I mean, but anyway, it's an interesting story. They go into this aspect, and you'll see it again, which seems a bit more fantastic than could be, but then who's to say? We don't know what the conditions are beyond our little place here in the universe, and what different forces, gravity and whatnot, could have on the laws of physics beyond our little small stellar environment. So the idea that giant cells could float around and infect you, and what are they infecting them with? Smaller cells. I don't know. But and then it forms this other creature, and it's a different kind of life. Star Trek at least tried to do this, where you come up with concepts that instead of just, and then later on, I gotta admit, it was too much of it was the joke of the forehead of the week and that sort of thing, because it was cheaper and they were doing more stories based on interactions and relationships, what have you, in those shows. But for science fiction concept and what aliens could be, you really don't know, and Star Trek would try to stretch that to where the aliens did look nothing like humans, and to keep that. It's not easy to do, and a lot of times you don't really have the time in a 1 hour TV show to process that like you can with movies like 2001 and Arrival and all that, where it's so abstract you don't quite even you communicated with an alien and you don't even know you did, and that's because it's so, the gap between the two is so vast. But the idea of, having creatures like floating jellyfish or whatever and stuff like that, well, you can do that today, which it should have been utilized more in sci-fi shows, because the special effects make it possible. At the time, they really didn't have that kind of thing. But a lot of times when the Enterprise is just encountering some glowing light or whatever have you, that might be accurate. Who's to say? Stuff like that. Yeah. So, gotta give them kudos for that and effort and whatnot, as Star Trek, unlike Star Wars and stuff like that, is, of course, more akin to science fiction than the latter. So, there is that. And the other interesting thing is, we get a little insight of Kirk's family, and then that's it. We never hear about it again. His nephew, Peter Kirk, survives. So, if people wanted to have a lineage of the Kirk family in future versions of Star Trek, which are probably never going to happen now because of recent events. Oh, jeez. But then again, maybe. It is possible to suggest that, yes, there is a legacy of the Kirk family. Unfortunately, Kirk himself, his son died, and we saw that in Search for Spock. So, as far as we know, of course, he did get around a lot. But as far as we know, that was the only child, a child he had. So, his nephew, though, we don't know what became of him. We know nothing about him. I don't know about novels and comic books may have addressed this. So, there you go. Whatever family this kid ended up having, is possible that there could be a Kirk in the future, and one could do that. But it's, one of those things that would be a bit on the nose and whatnot. And then would the character be just like Kirk? Obviously, the obvious intention would make them nothing like him. But anyway, it's just one of those things that for an overall universe and development of Star Trek that later became, this is something that was never referred to again, and yet it could have. But anyway, it's still there. So there you go. All right. Thank you for watching and listening. Say, why not like and subscribe, and check out that link description below. That'll take you to my many stores that have plenty of goodies for you. And most notably, you can head over to indieplanet.com, where you can get a copy of my comic book Night Night. Oh, yeah. And, of course, you can catch my podcast, Mr Nailsin Show, over at RadioMisfits.com. And, of course, you can watch my videos on BitChute.